All right. Well, welcome to the first Binny's Spirits remote tasting, I guess we'll call it. My name is Pat Brophy. I'm the Director of Spirit Sales here at Binny's. Joined today by Brett Pontani, who is over at the Binny's Tasting Room, it looks like. How are you doing, Brett?
I am well, Pat. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. And Monique Houston is with us. Monique is the Director of Spirits for Winebow and a good friend of the Whiskey Hotline, and has
Wait. Is that the correct title?
It's
Monique?
not.
Yeah, what is the correct title?
It's not. It's
Does it matter?
It doesn't really matter to me. I'm an executive now. It doesn't matter.
Oh, an executive. Okay. Yeah, she's very important, everyone. And more importantly,
Does that
as a
get you
friend of
better
the hotline.
bathrooms?
Stop it. We are here to talk about Scotch whiskey tonight, not bathrooms, thankfully. So Monique is the importer and also local distributor for one of mine and Brett's favorite brands, and that's Signatory Vintage and Edradour. So for those of you unaware, Signatory Vintage is an independent bottler, meaning that they are buying casks from anybody and everybody all over Scotland, aging them until they see fit or until someone like Brett or myself or Monique goes over and says, we'd like to buy this whole barrel for our store. So we usually go over there actually about this time of year to pick some barrels, and that is obviously not on the cards this year. Yeah, that's sad. But we did just get some barrels in that came from our most recent trip back in the fall, right? And so we've got 4 new barrels here at probably about half the Binny stores right now, and we're going to taste through those today. So which one are we going to start with, Monique?
Well, we're going to start with an Auchroisk. So Auchroisk, when I say it, sounds like it's got a TH in it, but it sure does not. It's got a CH in it. It looks like that. I'm getting used to all this virtual stuff. These are Auchroisk. Auchroisk is an interesting one because in general, when I used to get to work with this spirit, so this is owned by Diageo, so it's like one of the largest, it is the largest spirits company in the world. They also own Guinness, they own a lot of different brands, but notably, probably to a lot of you out there, they own Johnnie Walker. And so they own 28 different single malt Scotch distilleries. And you'll be very familiar with some of them, Talisker, Lagavulin, some distilleries that get bottled often as independent bottlings, but we're actually going to taste 3 from their distilleries today that never get bottled as independent bottlings, and one of them is Auchroisk. And Auchroisk, the biggest issue with it initially was that it came across to the United States and people couldn't pronounce it. People just absolutely couldn't pronounce it. You throw that CH in the middle. And so they pulled the range back from the United States. And that was when actually the range called the Singleton came out, if anybody's ever seen the Singleton out there. And this is, so something that we don't see very often. We never see Auchroisk in the United States. Diageo does not bottle this as an independent as an independent distillery. The bulk of this would go into blends, into things like Johnnie Walker, or famously J&B in the case of Auchroisk. It's, pretty fabulous. This particular cask, this is a 10-year-old. This one, I'm going to look over at the bottle right now. I didn't memorize it. Bottled in a first-use hogshead, outturned 219 bottles, bottled at 59.8% alcohol. So this went in at 63.5, came out about 4% lighter 10 years later. So this is in a first-use hogshead. One of you guys want to address what a hogshead is? You got some barrels behind you, Pat.
I do. There are several hogsheads behind me here in the barrel yard at the Springbank Distillery. As you can see, I'm used to cold weather, so I'm only wearing a sweater today. But a hogshead is the kind of industry standard size barrel for Scotch single malt whiskey. It is about 250 liters, right? So roughly about 10% bigger than an ASB, an American Standard barrel, which is the 53-gallon barrel we use for bourbon. This 250-liter size was a nice balance of liquid to oak ratio. It fit well in their racks. It's still small enough that it's easy to move around, but it's a little bit bigger so you can cram more liquid into the same square footage. It's just kind of the standard size. Now a hogshead
it would have been modeled somewhat off of what was being used in the still wine industry as well, because barriques are roughly running right in between that 250, some of them up to 300 liters.
Yeah.
So that would have been part of the genesis when they remade barrels. They would remake barrels close to the size of the wine barrels.
And that's the other thing with hogsheads is usually they are remade barrels. So they'll take bourbon barrels, break them down, add some staves to them, and just make them a little fatter. And that's where you get that extra volume. And they can do the same thing with sherry barrels, with wine barrels. You can turn any other barrel into a hogshead with a skilled enough cooper. Right?
I'll tell you, Pat, speaking of rebuilding a little bit fatter, that's basically what the coronavirus has done for me. I'm going to come out of this Monique hogshead just a little bit fatter.
about 10% more plush than the old Monique.
Honestly, now that I think about it, 10% is probably right.
10% is good economic growth numbers. Any business would be thrilled with 10% growth.
Yeah,
so you really can't be disappointed.
Well, so this is at 59.7% alcohol. A Thrusk, I'm going to share my screen here real quick. I've got a nice, oh no, my host disabled participant screen sharing. Well, for all of our whiskeys, for the first three, we're actually geographically quite close together. So while we're tasting a Thrusk, Dailuaine, and Strathmill, they're all up in the middle of Speyside. So they're really classic Speyside whiskeys. When we say Speyside, we're literally saying distilleries near the side of the river Spey. And so because they're Speyside distilleries, okay, let's try and share this again so everybody can see on a map. So I just pulled up literally just a Google map. Okay, let's do it. Let's share, guy. Okay, not that. We don't want to look at open questions. You guys know. Okay, I put us on a bicycle because I wish that I were in Scotland on a bicycle. That seems like a really good idea. And
riding on the A9 is not a good idea.
I mean, and it would take me 12 hours, which I'm probably not capable of doing anyway. But so we can basically see the whole of Scotland here. Down here where my arrow is right now, you're looking at the lowlands. Loosely, once you get kind of around the Edinburgh-Glasgow line and you pass north, then you're up in the Highlands. That actually encompasses all of this. And then this area right around here is Speyside. And so you can see we're at a Thrusk here right now. And if we zoom in, you can see actually how close these first three distillers are that we're actually going to taste. And you see Dufton, very famous whiskey producing area, as is Huntly, Longmorn, Rothes, a lot of you will know, Craigellachie. These are the names of towns, but actually as I'm scrolling around here, a lot of you out there will know Miltonduff, that's a distillery, Craigellachie, Aberlour, Ballindalloch. All of these things are named after distilleries too. So you see that these are very, very close together, the first three that we're tasting. And then eventually we'll head on down to Edradour, one of Brett's favorite towns right here. I know you're holding back right now, Brett. I'm pretty proud of you.
Thank you, Brett.
It's Fauchbars.
It's Fauchbars. And so over here, if my screen flipped over, you can see a picture of what the stills look like at a Thrusk. So these are going to be really traditional kind of what we call lantern shaped stills. So they have kind of reflux. You'll have whiskey that will start to vaporize. It'll come up right here. It'll get lighter, lighter, lighter as it has to hit, but it's got to really get light to get past this part. So this is really challenging. And in a lot of cases with whiskey as it's vaporizing, the challenge right here will actually cause it to fall back down. So that's where the reflux happens in a still like this. And then as it vaporizes, gets lighter, 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 up over here, down the line arm and into these condensers back here at the stills.
And that's also an upward, tilting. Yeah, that's an upward tilting line arm.
This is
going to get more reflux.
More reflux, so it's going to cause more of the heavier vapors to fall back down, So this is, as you would expect, even looking at the stills, lots of copper contact, lots of opportunities for reflux here and here. So it's a pretty light spirit. That's why we started with it. For me, these are all obviously in stock at Binny's right now. They're brand new casks, but most of you out there have probably not tasted them. I opened these bottles today for our tasting, but I'm not sure that I've tasted these since we had them last fall. So pretty exciting stuff. For me, this is very classic Speyside. Lots of honey, lots of orchard fruit, even though it's almost 60% alcohol. What do you guys think of this one? We picked this barrel together. What do you two think? Did we do a good job?
I like this barrel a lot. I like the Thrusk a lot.
Yeah, I mean it's that classic lighter style, which probably to me, hews a little bit closer to the J&B style, which actually the Strathmill kind of will as well, because those were both big. Before Diageo ended up with them, those would have been distilleries would have been owned by the predecessor company that would have owned J&B before it all turned into this monolith. Yeah, just, light fruit, sort of graham crackery. Like there's a bready, grainy character to it, but it's kind of like light graham cracker, granola, that sort of thing.
There's a lot of nice ripe orchard fruit in this. Like I get a lot of kind of pear with like cracked pepper over the top almost. That's just been barely grilled, but not smoky. It's
so funny.
Oddly specific.
I gotta be honest with you. I've never grilled a pear, period. And then probably wouldn't think to put cracked pepper over the top of it. But now I'm thinking if it tastes like this whiskey, that might be, it seems like the kind of-
What do you do with your old pears?
My old pears, my O pears. I think it's the kind of dessert that you trick a child into thinking is dessert. When they want the ice cream and the chocolate, you say, I'm gonna grill this nice pear for you.
The brand is, for the question that was just asked, the brand is a Thrusk. The brand is Signatory Vintage. The particular distillery that we're on right now is a Thrusk, which is in the center of Speyside.
I'm gonna type them on, there we go, Brody.
We have one other question that came in the Q&A, which was Jay and Karen Lee asked, will there be a delay on new Signatory picks because of you guys not being able to go pick right now?
Oh, Jay and Karen, you're so wonderful. Thanks for asking. So actually, we picked these, Pat, we were all on that trip. We actually chose these barrels last May, and they did not get bottled until the fall. One of the really strange kind of anomalies in the global spirits market is that the United States is one of the only markets that requires a 750 milliliter bottling. The rest of the world is 700 ml. So we've got our own labels, and then they have to go through and do labels bottle by bottle for Binny's or for Winebow for my company. And they're running 700 milliliter bottles most of the time. So it's actually only every few months that we have to slot ourselves in for a 750 ml bottle. So these got here in December. This is just kind of the first opportunity that we're having. Our plan was to release them for the annual Whiskey Week here at Binny's, which would have been about a month ago. But obviously we didn't get to do that, so we're getting to taste them here today. But to answer your question, sorry to be long-winded, Brett and I were over in Scotland very briefly in October, and we were able to spend the afternoon with Des and Andrew and the team at Signatory at the Edradour Distillery. And we picked, what did we bring back? 8 samples? And the 3 of us sat down a few weeks ago with some other folks and retasted them, and we picked 5 that got bottled.
Yeah, I'm looking for the list right now.
Yeah, and they got bottled last week, and they should be on the water, which will take probably about a month. And I expect them to be available for sale in about 5 weeks. I would say the second week in June. And I will say too, just kind of overall, we've got a 10-year-old, 3 10-year-olds and a 22-year-old in front of us today. We have tried to pretty consistently find 1 or 2 casks that are 20 years plus that are really special and we think are a really great value. But with this range, we're really blessed to be able to get things to you that are very unique, very rare as single malts, and really affordable. So we can get a 10-year-old single cask out to you at, what price is this, Pat? For the low, low price.
Oh, this one is $79.99 right now.
$79.99. 59.7% alcohol, single cask. And this is kind of the perfect one especially if you're, let's say, a blended Scotch drinker, and you like kind of the things that would go into a Johnny Walker. This is going to taste like the best, most concentrated Johnny Walker you've ever had. It's really, really gorgeous. Highly recommend. 5 stars.
We have another question here.
Go ahead.
About filtration, and it says, this is from Spirited Whiskey. I know you mentioned the lighter palate weight of the liquid. How about mid-palate and finish due to the fact that it's 120 proof? Gentle filtration done. I would say this whiskey maintains a fairly robust palate. It's not super thick, but it is a coating full palate. These whiskeys do not see any chill filtration at all. They see very basic coarse filtration just to make sure no chunks of wood end up in the bottle, and that's about it.
Yeah, for those of you that have ever seen bottles that have chunks of wood in them, they have been filtered and the wood has been added back in.
Right. You wouldn't be talking about Blackadder Raw Cask, would you?
Maybe not. I love this. I'm looking off to the side here. I see lots of friends. Hi, Jamie. Hi, Rich. This is great.
On the casks, the previous question, so what specifically we took was a 2007 Dailuaine in Hogshead, a 2010 Linkwood in Hogshead, a 2006 Glenlossie in bourbon barrel first fill. And so what's it gonna be, 14? That'll be nice. And then if any of you had a chance to try our bottling, which is heavily peated Bunnahabhain, what it's being referred to now in the independent world is called Stoisha. And we took a 2014 Stoisha, which will be a little bit under 6 years old when they bottled it. And I believe that he bottled all that stuff up at the beginning of April, right? So a couple, 3 weeks ago.
Yep.
And then what did you guys take for Winebow, Monique?
I don't remember off the top of my head. I've been so focused on these four. So the ones that Brett just named off, those are the ones that are all going to be here in June. And there'll be a couple more. There'll be a couple more to boot, but we tasted some really, really solid casks when we were there.
So to make the answer to that question even longer, we can still pick casks, even though we don't go there. We can always have Des and Andrew pull samples from barrels that they feel are interesting in the warehouse and mail them to us here. We'll sit down, we'll taste through everything, and we can still pick barrels that way. So thankfully.
Yeah, we're really, really fortunate that they, they have logs going back of everything we've ever tasted. We've still got stickers on the side of barrels that say, I think they say Brett and Monique, from things that we've tasted over the years. And we're also really fortunate to be able to earmark things that we think the sister cask is going to be great. Let's bottle it in a year. Or you know what, this is in a sherry finishing cask.
Oh, we might have lost her.
Yes, Monique. So I think what she's actually talking about is in this program, because we've been going to Signatory for so long, actually going back more than 15 years. Yeah. 2003, I believe, was the first time that I went, 2004, and we've been going as a group for at least 10 years. And what we're talking about is the ability, not only when we're doing some of these selections, just to drill down a little bit more, not only are we picking for the current year's inventory, we're keeping notes. We're keeping notes continually on barrels that we've tried that we sort of want to keep an eye on from year to year to year as they develop. The Mortlach was a great example. This Mortlach we're taking is going to be an 11-year-old. We're looking at a Mortlach that's going to be an 11-year-old. The first time we did one of those Mortlachs was as a 7. We ended up doing a 7, an 8, a 9, a 10, an 11. So we've been following this whole series of casks since they were 7 years old for the last 5 or 6 years. It was a whole series of first fill bourbon, fresh American standard barrel bourbons that they acquired a whole large parcel of very young that they have been slowly but surely working their way through. So.
All right, well, let's taste the next whiskey. Hopefully we got Monique back here. So the next one we're going to taste is actually the oldest one we're going to taste too. This is a Dailuaine, which is one of my favorite distilleries. This is a 22-year-old. I don't have the bottle in front of me, and I'm not sure of the strength. I can find it real quickly, though, if we take a second here. But this is also cask strength, and this is currently on the shelves for $160. 51.9% is the strength. What else can you tell us about Dailuaine, Brett?
Dailuaine is interesting. Dailuaine is a workhorse component, just like a lot of the other distilleries of the Johnnie Walker's blends. I believe most specifically Bell's, although contributes a couple of other interesting things. One, Dailuaine's one of the few distilleries we have never had an opportunity to visit. But Dailuaine, when you're driving along the A95 on the way up to the big towns of Speyside, Aberlour, past Dufton, past Craigellachie, eventually to Elgin, Dailuaine kind of sits in a little hollow on a river, and is very industrial. They were a long time, they had direct fired stills. I believe that that's been switched out now, but if I remember correctly, Dailuaine for a long time had direct fired stills.
And they have purifiers on the line arms too.
Okay.
There's a lot of those Diageo distilleries that kind of got scaled up in the mid 20th century. Blended brands grew, they put purifiers on the line arms at a lot of different distilleries, and it makes that very just light fruity style.
Well, it does like fruit, but I still think there's some grip. See, for me, Dailuaine
Has a oilier mouthfeel, right?
Dailuane is the spelling of Dailuaine. That was a question that just came through.
There we go.
Yeah, it does. It's a funny balance because the other one that you think of that is the other, you were talking about purifiers being added in, or purifiers, reflux arms.
Do we have that hilarious Monique picture right now?
That is from, I was actually there. That was that
was your birthday party, right, Brett?
That was exactly. That was my birthday party. That was the Morpheus. That was the Morpheus parade at Mardi Gras last year. Not this year, the Mardi Gras that infected the whole southern part of the United States with COVID-19.
I mean,
all right.
But last year's Mardi Gras.
I'm back
on a Friday night. And
so Monique, we're talking about Dailuaine.
Yada.
Yes. And what an amazing whiskey it is, and how you never see it. There is not a Dailuaine bottled commercially that's available consistently in the United States. Right. The only way to get Dailuaine is through an independent bottler, and that's one of our draws to this. We always try every year to bring in distilleries that you otherwise can't get, or that have been aged in a way that otherwise is unavailable, whether that's like some big sherried Caol Ila or something that you might not see. But we always try to bring different and new options.
We just
and
went
we
like
were
this.
We were also on the purifiers they have in the balance, because I think that Dailuaine has a lot of grip for something that has a purifier. And the way that I would say to people, think about it, a purifier can clean some things up and take some edges off, but it doesn't mean it has to get rid of like a necessary or a sort of a rich oiliness. Because while they have a purifier, look at the shape of the stills versus the Auchroisk stills.
Big fat
If you look,
stills.
like, remember the Auchroisk had that little narrow, so they had a ball, then a little narrow hole, then it went into a bigger top.
There you go.
These, right. See that little narrow neck in there, which Monique pointed out, cuts off a lot of the reflux. Now look at that. There's a lot more passage there for stuff to come through.
Heavier, oilier compounds can make it into the final distillate.
And nothing here to stop it. There's not the little lip there. It's not lantern shaped. There's not a boil ball. These are declining line arms. A lot of things that are actually trying to push the spirit through a little bit faster, which let heavier congeners, all kinds of things. This one's 51.9% alcohol. So when we say 51.9% alcohol, all of these are cask strength. None of these have had water added to them. All four casks are in the way that we tasted them at the distillery. It's great. And when we say 51.9% alcohol, that means that it is 48.1% water. So where does all that flavor come from? So you've got those two things are the only things in the bottle, but that little teeny tiny bits in there are the congeners, are the esters, are all of those flavors that are made up of chemical compounds that come together. And when you've got just these really smooth sides on here, this declining line arm, more heavy congeners go into the final distillate that then interact with the wood and, evaporation and, air, oxygen, all kinds of things that are going on out there. Very, very different flavors.
So in terms of that,
so the purifier
it's right here, but you can't see it because this is a bad picture. But it's behind here.
Well,
it's a little.
But the purifier. So because Pat started talking about the purifier, and the whole principle of the purifier is it balances both, because you have a whole lot of liquid passing through, or you have a whole lot of vapor that can go up that really wide arm, and the purifier is going to clean up some, but not all of it. The closest for a really rich, full flavored, gritty whiskey can be is Talisker. Talisker also has a purifier, a reflux.
Yep.
A lot of a reflux drain off. And they do in the same thing, yet Talisker still maintains that really rich, the peat character comes through, that really rich, oily character. And I think that's the balance of Dailuaine. Are the stills, and the purifier cleans up a little bit, but it's probably only still taking a small percentage off of what else is just running through very rapidly.
Yeah, this Dailuaine, I think, still has all that lovely, bright, fresh orchard fruit, but it has like a bit of a layer of a toffee butterscotch thing going on underneath it. It's got a heavier flavor to it overall. It's still fruity, but it's more of a caramelized fruit. We have two more questions. Is there a Brophy favorite and a Pontani favorite when it comes to the individual distilleries you bottle as Signatory?
For me, it's a combination. I have my favorite distilleries. You know, it's always a joke. If it were Brett's Beverage Depot, we could fit it on a table. It's Vinny's, and we've got 60,000 square feet to fill up. So it's a balance. There are certain distilleries I like when we find. I'm a big Mortlock fan. You know, a lot of stuff we can't bottle just because you could only do them if you bottled on their own. I love Glenfarclas. I love Pulteney. I've always loved Balblair. I love Craigellachie, which we have done a lot of.
Mm-hmm.
For me, you know, as we were talking when Monique was off a little bit, I was kind of following a little bit along the lines of what she was saying about us constantly going to distilleries or constantly going to Signatory and trying like families of casks and picking them off year after year after year, and then having them on the shelf at the same time to show maturation. So for me, part of the favorite is picking distilleries I like, but either A.
Now we lost Brett.
Ruh-roh. That's what you get.
All right, well then I get to answer my favorite then.
Yeah.
So my favorites from Signatory have generally been some of the peatier stuff. I've really loved the heavily peated Bunnahavens we've done over the years, no matter what they're called, whether they're called heavily peated Bunnahaven or Stoisha or something else. I really like young peaty stuff too. So we've done a couple young Kalilas from Signatory over the years that have been really
Gorgeous.
good. But on the other side, this is going back, 10, 12 years, but we did some like mid to late teenage Lafroigs that were just incredible.
And now we can't afford them anymore.
Oh,
frankly.
they're crazy. I mean, the pricing on Lafroig has gone crazy. So, but thankfully we get these really gorgeous, heavily peated Bunnahavens that I think really kind of fill that gap for me.
Yeah, the difficulty sometimes with this range is that these folks like the team, Andrew and Des and the team at Signatory, they're buying casks kind of on the open market, but they've got great relationship with Diageo, with like Bacardi Doers of the world. So they're negotiating for casks, but so are other independent bottlers. So are Cadenhead, so are Duncan Taylor, so are, plenty of other people. So it means that there have been different rules have gone into effect. So you'll notice last year we bottled some Signatory as Orkney, but we couldn't disclose the distillery.
We can't call it Highland Park anymore, even though it's Highland Park.
We could, but we'd pay twice as much for it because basically, in effect, you've signed an NDA saying, okay, I can't say who this distillery is, but Highland Park and the company behind them, Edrington, has put so much money behind the marketing and the packaging and the new expressions that they don't just want someone to be able to put this gorgeous single cask out there and kind of one-up them. So we can know what it is. You all can figure out what it is. There's only 2 distilleries up on Orkney. Those are, they're Highland Park. They're absolutely gorgeous. Yeah. And, we're finding a lot of the same things with those Lafroigs now, sometimes even with Kalila. We never used to see it with Macallan. We're starting to see it a lot with Macallan and Glenlivet because they want more, kind of protection all along the way that they're bottling what they want to bottle. It's why you very, very rarely would see a Glenfarclas, a Balvenie, or a Glenfiddich. They're all, family-owned Scottish distillers that really retain the rights to those casks and their names all the way through the process. So for us, it's fun to find these little gems. This Dailuaine at 22 years. BJ, I saw your question on here. How do we compare this to the fabulous Fettercairn that we did a few years ago, which was a 28-year-old? This is, it's different, very different in flavor profile. This is a little more floral. I was kind of hearing your tasting notes. Honeysuckle, it's really, really stunning, really oily, really viscous. It's interesting to get those floral notes and those fruity notes, but with a lot of weight, almost like you've made a honey-based syrup.
Yeah.
Out of the flowers and the fruits. It's gorgeous. How much is this one, Pat?
This is $160 right now. For a 22-year-old full-strength Scotch, I think that's a relative bargain. If this was some of those other distilleries you just named, if this was a distillery bottled 22-year-old full-strength Balvenie, this would cost $600, and you can get it here for $160, or, we run these things on sale too. We have coupon days. This is a lot of value.
If Diageo bottled this, because they do bottle some rare cask series every once in a while, if Diageo bottled this, it would be $600.
Yeah, totally.
And by the way, in the room to hosting, BJ's got his hand up.
Yeah, he's so polite.
He says that is a terrific price. Thank you, BJ. You're a terrific customer.
Sounds like a steal. I like these guys.
We have one more question here on price too, is how are the tariffs affecting your pricing on single cask selections? Negatively.
Yeah, negatively. What's crazy is this is even before COVID, obviously. So we started down this road last year in October, knowing that there was going to be a 25% tariff, but you all know it's not as easy as that. So it has to go through, that happens at the point of entry. So you get 25%. Then it goes through the importer. Then it goes through your state distributor. So then it goes through me. Then it goes to Brett. So that means that that little bit that's tacked on, by the time it gets to the end customer, you're actually paying probably 40 to 45%. It's not just a simple, flat 25%. So, I mean, if you were already going to buy a $100 bottle of whiskey, you're probably okay to buy a $140 bottle of whiskey. Where I really think we see it hurt us is kind of in the very, very high end, where that's really exaggerated, and in the really low end, when, you used to be able to get a good bottle of aged single malt for $30. Now probably those are all $40.
Yeah.
Right. But that being said, but they were also based on, because we have, so like the Stoish is a great example. We have some FOBs of pre-tariff and post-tariff, and at least as far as Signatory went, they were pretty good about it. They didn't, the effective increase on the shelf was actually less than 25%. So some of that cost was shared along the line. And if you look at, there was a big stare down in tariffs in general between the very high volume brands. And so you certainly didn't see a 35 to 40% increase in things like Glenfiddich 12, Glenmorangie Traditional, the three Glens, Glenlivet 12-year-old, which are the three #1 selling SKUs in the market. They went up maybe 10 or 15% because, one, the view for a lot of these producers was this isn't an opportunity, it's a very, very bad thing. And so they're going to mitigate as much as possible to, the increase is going to consumers. Two, quite frankly, people don't want to lose share, not only to each other within the Scotch market, but people don't want to lose share to other products. So now all of a sudden Irish blends are cheaper because they weren't tariffed. Now all of a sudden American whiskeys are cheaper because they're not being tariffed. And I think the other view of it was, for a lot of people, is everybody is hoping that this was just a very short-sighted mistake and that these things will go away sooner rather than later. So we won't have to go in too far. Now, the real thing that we want to address for everybody is, when you hear the announcement and read in the paper that the tariffs have gone away, don't hold your breath waiting for all the prices to immediately drop to old levels, because that's probably not going to happen. Some money will be made back by maintaining prices on the amount of tariff that's been eaten since October 14th of last year, which is when they took effect.
Those really low priced expressions are typically loss leaders for those companies anyway. They want you kind of driving the continual business and the cash flow of a Glenfiddich 12 every day, but where they're actually making their money is on the higher marks. And so the second, if those tariffs do go away, everybody's always going to say, well, that was too cheap anyway. That was a 12-year-old product or whatever it was. So they're never.
Well, yeah, people will pay $35. So.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Well, let's taste the next
Let's get to
one.
the next whiskey.
I'm thirsty. And Jamie, I love that. Jamie said out in the chat that the Dailuaine tasting notes sounded like Viognier. And if I had to say that this Dailuaine 22 was a wine, Viognier is right there. So yeah, we were spot on. My wine education is
fruit and phenolic. Yeah, fruit and phenolic. I mean, there's a lot of fruit, but it's the oily and phenolic.
So our next whiskey is a Strathmill 10-year-old. So from the Strathmill Distillery, this was distilled in 2009, bottled at the end of last year, 262 bottles, 56.7% alcohol. And this was, again, in a first-use hogshead. So this will be a rebuilt set of bourbon barrels. This guy, will go back out to my little map out here, even though everybody knows.
This is spicier. What's the proof on this, Monique?
This is 56.7.
Wow, it's lower.
Yep.
But I think if you knock that down, to me, this is like vanilla. This is like vanilla lemon cookies.
This is also, I think the whiskey itself in this case is kind of spicy. So now we've gone over here, and I'll give us back out of this.
So Monique, if you remember, can you show the lane that one drives in the town of Keith when you turn off to go to the Strathmill Distillery? What lies along the lane as you're driving to Strathmill?
Roadkill.
Do you remember Ricky Cruikshank? Hamish.
Yes.
Hamish, the Americans want to see the distillery. I'm going to be up in 5 minutes.
There's a really amazing teeny tiny cooperage right there that Brett and I stopped for water and accidentally heard the sounds of a cooperage. So you could hear metal on metal and metal on wood, and kind of followed the sounds to this very small cooperage with no health and safety whatsoever. No goggles, no masks, sparks and wood and metal flying. But yeah, we were really, really lucky to meet up with Mr. Cruikshank there, who talked his brother into letting us into the rebuilt Glen Keith distillery, which was just down the road. But we're out here at Strathmill. I wanted to back it up.
It was not open yet.
No.
Yeah.
I wanted to back it up so that everybody out there could get a perspective too. We're not super, super close to the water, but we're pretty close to the North Coast. So sometimes with Strathmill, and kind of why I put it third in this list too, it's back into a first fill hogshead, so you're getting a little bit more influence from the American oak. American oak tends to have a lot of that vanillin, coconut, tropical fruit, things like that. But I also think, Pat, with this, some of the spice is this kind of salt and peppery note that you can get from some effects of maritime aging. There are big, big warehouses on site here at Strathmill. And this is, you're actually coming down from the hills. Where you see the green on this map is more of the hills. Here you're starting to flatten out. And so you're getting a lot more of this maritime influence actually coming in from the water in some cases into Strathmill. So I think there's a little salt and pepper thing going on there too.
Mm-hmm.
No, go away.
Just a gorgeous whiskey.
You're like, we did a great job.
Yeah, yeah. It's almost got a bit of a citrus oil in the background that really works with that kind of peppery note.
Right.
Vanilla lemon cookies.
It is really, yeah, really, really, really gorgeous. I love the nose. It's just, it's got a lot of strength that's really, really vibrant. Non-peated, obviously, it's got a fairly long fermentation as well. They're going 60 to 90 hours. So I think you're developing a lot of really interesting flavors in there. This one's just really, really dynamic. I'm gonna pull up the still here. Wow, how much is this one?
This one is also $79.99, like the first one.
Steel. It's a steel.
Yeah, the alcohol doesn't. It's funny with all those, especially, I think that the alcohol kind of enhances the spice notes, but it also doesn't drink heavily alcoholic.
No.
You certainly would want to knock it down a little bit and
heat.
take the edge off, but yeah.
Speaking of coronavirus effects, effects on me, outside of me becoming a hogshead, also becoming heavily alcoholic. So you're really hitting all the high notes with me here.
I think we're all trying to work through a backlog of basement beers and whatnot. So is what it is.
I haven't had a beer in 7 weeks.
Yeah, some
Well,
of you
you're
out
better
there
than
will.
all of us.
No, because I've been drinking the shit out of mezcal.
That's
All
what
right.
happens. Well, let's chat a little bit. Actually, what I wanted to do here is maybe pause for a second, because we've just tasted from 3 distilleries that are all owned by Diageo. These are all typically whiskeys that would be considered an element of something that would go into a Johnny Walker, a J&B, a Dewar's, a blend like that. That's what all of these are. Capacity between these 3 distilleries, they're all between 1.5 and 6 million liters. So let's say you've got about 12 million annual liters sitting on the table here, all going through the likes of Johnny Walker. How do we get a hold of these casks? How does Signatory get a hold of these casks? What is an independent bottler really at base? So when we get to go to the Edradour distillery, which houses the Signatory vintage company, there's casks there from 120 operating distilleries and some closed distilleries. You'll find the rare, Port Ellen or Brora or something like that. We never get to taste those. We never get to buy those, but they are there.
We've been asking to taste those for many years, though, but they just
yeah, exactly. So let's just round table a little bit about independent bottlings, what this really is. How does Andrew get a hold of these casks and why?
Well, I mean, a lot of it is, so Andrew was in hotel management. Andrew ran hotels in Germany for years, especially on the food service side. So he's extremely well connected both in the Scotch world and in the wine world. He started this company with his brother Brian now, 20 years ago? I think Signatory Vintage Company started in Edinburgh.
30 years ago. They just had remember they did the 30th
that's
anniversary
right.
bottlings
That's
last
right.
year.
They just did their 30th anniversary. So in tandem, another key to that is Des McGactry is a Northern Irishman who worked for a number of years for Diageo, still has good connections. And because they are an active distillery and because they own the trademark rights to a blend, and they're buying grain, they have the ability to not just buy barrels, but to trade barrels. And based on the stocks they have, they're able to insert themselves. They're involved in barrel purchases and barrel trades of all of the stock that's floating around amongst the distilleries. So you talked to, Monique, you talked about Diageo owning 28 distilleries. Johnny Walker, Bell's, J&B, all these whiskeys contain a lot more than distillate from 28 distilleries. So everybody trades with each other. And so all the companies are very actively, Dewar's will have a value. In fact, a lot of these Diageo casks that we are tasting now as single barrels that we bought from Signatory got from Bacardi, because Bacardi had stocks that they weren't going to use to blend into Dewar's. They were trading back out into the market to trade for other flavor components they did need. And so just like everybody else, these things fly around, and I need this taste profile. It's like buying ingredients for a recipe is basically what these blenders are doing. They're buying ingredients for a recipe. And that is a really critical piece of how Signatory is able to get their hands on a lot of these things, because they can be active participants in those markets. And because they're working on constructing a blend, and because they're purchasing a lot of new make spirit and grain spirit for the blend, that gets them in the market to start trading things and peeling across and buying some parcels, trading some parcels, buying some more parcels. They've also done a nice job of what they have bottled. They're not in the business of bottling dogs. They move those along, which means that the companies tend to trust them a little bit more than other independent bottlers, because they are pretty conscientious about what they pick and bottle, not only for their own reputation, but for the reputation of the producer, which, as you were saying earlier, is huge for a lot of producers.
Yeah, no one's going to have a bad experience with an Auchroisk from Signatory. And that's why they're so willing to let Signatory use the name Auchroisk, because they trust them to only put quality stuff in a bottle. Whereas there's some other independent bottlers out there that will bottle any cask that's just lying around. And so that's also a reason we do so much business with Signatory.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there's kind of I don't even think that there's kind of there is definitely a lot of misconceptions out in the market. So we've bottled our own Lafroig, we've bottled our own Macallan, and people will say, well, that was Macallan that Macallan didn't want. That was bad Macallan. We've, in particular from Signatory, we bottled a lot of our own Glenlivet. We've tasted 100 Glenlivet casks over the past 10 years. Yep. And some of them are absolutely gorgeous. Some of them taste like, a great version, but a cask strength version of Glenlivet that you know and love. Some of them are so off the charts that blind, you would never even know that the distillate was from that distillery. And very often too, Andrew comes into these when they're very young, when in some cases, when they're not even legally single malt. You can buy these whiskeys as new make from these distilleries in cask when they are 1 year old, 2 year old.
Yeah, you said when you were off for a minute, I was talking about the Mortlock, and I told him that was a big parcel of first fill bourbon barrels filled with Mortlock that Andrew was able to get when they were 5 years old. Yep. And we've been picking them off for the last 7 years.
Yeah, exactly. And so you can almost get to them at pennies on the dollar when all that stock is not selling into blends. And actually the blended market is still there's still 9 times more blends sold for single malt in the world, but that audience is falling and the market for single malt is rising. So as the needs to blenders actually fall, sometimes bit by bit, you can buy these whiskeys early on, much less, and then you're taking on the investment. You're paying yourself rent to have these whiskeys in your warehouse and all kinds of things.
One way to look at to do the math. So it wasn't very within the last 5 years, I believe, that Glenfiddich became the world's first million case brand. So that is 7 million liters of sales. That distillery produces 15 to 16 million liters of pure alcohol, which translated into bottled alcohol is even more than that. So their total sales of their flagship is less than half of their total production. So where does the rest of that whiskey go? I mean, that's part of the answer there. Macallan, for what they released, Macallan's a massive distillery. A lot of these, Glenlivet's a big distillery, and they can't bottle as their own product all the different things that they're producing, which is another sort of way to answer that question about why we're not just getting rejects from the distilleries.
You can
they
see
can't bottle everything they make.
The picture that I pulled up just here, these are a bunch of barrels that were dumped outside the Signatory distillery. So you see a Lafroig up in the top right-hand corner. That's a Glen Turret right below it. You can see that there were ex-bourbon barrels, you know, down here. This other picture I just think is pretty because it had just rained. And so you see all these barrels of varying sizes. You can see up here, this was a big old sherry butt. You can see these little guys were probably bourbon barrels. The things that are in between are going to be wine barriques or hogsheads. So this is just after doing a whole big run of bottling. These are all the barrels sitting outside at Signatory. Really, really gorgeous. I love that.
Okay, we got another question here, which is any grain whiskey picks on the horizon? That is something we're always looking at, but it's kind of a limited audience. I appreciate the enthusiasm for grain whiskey, but every few years we usually take one, I suppose. The last one we did, I think, was a 12-year-old North British. Does that sound right?
Yep. We can get,
beautiful.
we
Kind
have
of drank like bourbon.
We could get a steady stream of grain, and Pat hit it right on the head, that are fantastic. We just kind of do it based on how well they sell, which unfortunately we need more grain fans out there, because if they sold a little bit quicker, we could do a grain a year or more, but we need to actually sell through what we get. So.
Yeah, there's a lot of misunderstanding too about what those are. I mean, traditionally they're going to be 100% wheat that's column distilled, that's intended to be aged and go into a blended whiskey. So they're kind of almost there as like it's a way to stretch the single malts into something and keep a consistent flavor in the blends. So they're not intended to individually as a single barrel taste great on their own. So it's rare that you find the one that really stands out and is wonderful, but when they are, I mean, it sounds like we've got some fans out there, they're absolutely amazing. Yeah, Jamie, to answer your question, Andrew is Andrew that owns the Edradour Distillery and Signatory Vintage Company. So Andrew, you know, long time, he's probably 40 plus years in the whiskey industry now, but bought Edradour and started Signatory Vintage Company 30 years ago. So he's our partner in the distillery. A curmudgeon that just drives around in a forklift in a pantsuit, jumpsuit, and scowls at people most of the time.
Smoke cigarettes constantly.
Smoke cigarettes. We love him.
He's
quit.
Amazing. No, he quit.
He quit smoking?
He quit. Remember when we were there in October, we talked to him, he had quit smoking.
Yeah, I didn't believe it.
I hope he kept that going. That's tough.
I do too. I do too.
What's our last whiskey?
Our last whiskey, and this is a great way to finish. Okay, so first off, let's just look at the color difference between these two 10-year-old whiskeys. So this is the Strathmill that we just had. This is the Edradour that we're about to taste. So this is Edradour 10-year-old. So this is from the Edradour Distillery, which is, they own the Signatory Vintage Company. So the same warehouse that you're going to see aging this Edradour and their peated expression, which is called Belechen, you're going to see casks of all these other distilleries all intermixed in it in a traditional dunnage warehouse. This was a first fill sherry butt, so that explains the color. This came out of an Oloroso sherry butt, where this came out of a rebuilt bourbon barrel. So this is a direct result, not of age. This isn't older, and it's not stronger. This is a direct result of what was in the cask before, and in this case, it was Oloroso sherry. So this came out of a first fill sherry butt, which means too, the other barrels all had 200 some bottles. The outturn for this was 652 bottles because it's twice as big. These are huge, they're sherry butts. Sherry likes big butts. 57.4% alcohol.
This is a pretty classic example of a sherry aged Highland malt whiskey. It's just loaded with gobs of dried fruit and toffee and spice and, you know, kind of that rich brown sweet baking spice. This is really, really good stuff.
But but definitely, but good cooperage and first fill, which part of the way you can tell, I think, is the fact that some sherry, it's funny, you will get people who will comment that they will try, and it's the people that say, well, this Macallan is peaty, and when in reality it's not peaty as all, because you get a little bit of a metallic tarriness, especially if sulfur's been used to preserve barrels that have gone across. This was obviously a very good barrel because you're not getting that sulfuric, bitter, sometimes metallic notes. Now, some people like that in sherry. I don't particularly like heavily sherried whiskeys myself. This is fantastic. This is, for me,
so good. And this is funny because even like Pat, you have to like this. And you are typically the guy that says Edradour's soapy. And it's because sometimes there'll be that little sulfur kick whether it's because of how the barrel was treated or because of how heavily, kind of overly sherried it was. This is such a beautiful balance between the wine and the whiskey. You can still taste the bar.
Oh, losing Monique again.
Yep. There. Oh. So I saw a couple of the questions while we're waiting to try to get, because their pictures are still up.
Yep.
BJ asked about how you address the rumors of Edradour. Well, one way, everything that there was a rumor that was floating it around, and I believe that it started because of a Cadenhead's bottling from sometime in the mid 90s that put a lot of people off of Edradour. And the answer is a couple. One, they are, so if you look at the stills are still up that she has there. So look at those tiny little stills. What that means is you don't get much reflux at all out of those tiny little stills. They also tend to take pretty broad cuts at Edradour, which means that because of the broad cuts, you're going to get more of the tails, which are more of that sort of metallic, phenolic, somewhat bitter elements. So that's actually going to be part of it that is going to contribute to that sulfuric, soapy sort of character. That's number one. The bottling that caused everybody to say that Edradour was soapy was also primarily a Cadenhead's bottling from the mid 90s that was distilled by a whole different regimen, whereas the current regimen, they don't do that. And because they've owned Edradour now for about 15 years, they've owned the distillery. They would have been the first time, I remember, like 2004, so 15, 16 years they've actually owned the distillery. And they've been producing the distillery. Everything that you're getting as Edradour now has actually been made under Andrew's guidance, which means that they're going to have a whole different set of practices than they might have had in the 80s and the 90s, when it was literally just a workhorse distillery for Pernod, who was using it as a part of the, I'm forgetting the blend, but there was the
one they have in the museum in front of the distillery,
exactly.
right? Yeah,
forgetting the blend.
King's
but it
Ransom.
was a workhorse.
King's Ransom.
So it was a workhouse distillery.
House of Lords is the other one. House of Lords.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that kind of addresses this soapy question.
So this is the Edradour distillery. Can you guys see this up on your screens now?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. That still is like as tall as me. The whole thing. It's teeny tiny little baby still. You could put your arms around this little boil ball right here. It's pretty incredible. So this was the smallest distillery in Scotland for many, many years. It was actually called Scotland's smallest distillery. And then with the advent of craft distilling, some distilleries came along that built even smaller distilleries. So now it's called Scotland's Little Gem. They have worm tub condensers. This is one of 7 distilleries in Scotland that still has these. So where we would see those shell and tube, those tall column condensers before, this is condensing outside in this copper tube. So this cold water that's outside is taking vapor from the stills running. So like it's going out the walls, these steeply declining line arms right here. So heavy oils, heavy flavors, sometimes those sulfury notes, soapy notes, whatever it is, not in the case of this one, really get through these stills pretty quickly. And then they actually come out of the wall, down these tubes, through this, and this natural cold water outside is what condenses it back down.
All right, we have two more questions.
And that's a little bit more of a lead on, the phenolic element, because of those worm tubs are much less efficient condensers than shell and tube, which means that they have a lot less copper contact, especially once they've condensed and turned into liquid. They're not really hitting the whole circle around. They're basically running on the bottom of that, which means that less of those oily characters are going to be pulled out in worm condensers than in shell and tube. Just less copper contact.
All right, 2 more questions about this whiskey. That spirited whiskey says that color looks awesome. How intense is the sherry influence compared to others out there? I would say if we're putting this on a scale of 1 to 10, I would say the sherry intensity would be about a 7. I think you get all of the fruit with none of the bad sulfury note.
Right.
It's very intense.
But it doesn't dominate
sherry,
the spirit.
But it's not. But it doesn't dominate the spirit.
You can
it's still in balance. I think you're right
Edradour.
out of 7.
Yep.
Yeah, you can still taste the barley.
Like dried, like with dried sultanas, just because you always have to say sultana at least once. But dried plums, raisiny dried fruits, figs, that sort of fruit character.
Okay, other question is from Gary, and he asks, how does this sherry cask compare to the 11-year 2006 Binny's did a couple years ago that was done in a Sauterne hogshead? That whiskey was one of my all-time favorites. That whiskey, I wish we had more of that left. I didn't buy enough and we still had it. So
that was the whiskey that made Pat admit that sometimes he liked Edradour. Every year going, we would taste Signatory cask and Pat's like, this is great, this is great, this is great. And then we get to a point where we have to buy, we want to buy some Edradour distillate, some Belecken, which is their peated distillate. And Pat would just cringe like, oh, it's going to be so sherried and soapy and whatever. But the one in Sauterne, the sweetness of the wine, that kind of cloying, heavy, floral, vibrant, like that nature played so well with the spirit. That one was absolutely stunning. I loved it. It was really fun for Pat to get to find one that he actually
It was just
liked.
like honey drizzled dried apricots. So I would say that the Sauterne cask still contributes a lot of dried fruit, but in a brighter, more golden fruit, I guess, whereas the sherry cask tends to influence darker dried fruit. So whenever I think sherry, I think like fig, raisin, plum, whereas Sauterne more of that kind of honeyed apricot, almost like the dried apple almost. It's just as intense with the fruit, but a darker fruit quality in the sherry versus the Sauterne.
This also, I think really good sherry always has chocolate notes, and that could be like more like cacao, like maybe not super sweet. This has so much dark chocolate in it, and I think this whiskey, I haven't gotten to taste it with dark chocolate, but it has so much cacao in it. It's so well balanced, and then that nice kind of black pepper too, and the finish is insane. I mean, for a 10-year-old whiskey, it's just really, really stunning.
This is a whiskey you give to either that you can give this to a sherry cask aged lover, but you can also give it to the enemies of sherry. And this would be something that they would be very, very well pleased for the people.
This actually, what's the price point on this, Pat?
Price point on this is $120. It's a little higher than some other 10-year Edradours, but the quality of this cask, I think, is one we haven't seen often.
Absolutely. This for me really rivals what the Macallan Cask Strength series was when they first started making red label Macallan Cask Strength in the late 80s, mid 90s. It's just, this is not a seasoned sherry cask that had sherry in it for 6 months and got dumped back out. Nice. This was good sherry wine that sat in a barrel for a number of years, and then whiskey went into this barrel. And I think that's a bit of a misnomer too, is that a lot of sherry matured whiskeys go into sherry barrels where the quality of the sherry is not that great. Sherry's been put in it and kind of rolled around in a really hot climate for 6 months to get the barrel to just sink, to just soak some over and then it goes over to Scotland.
They're seasoning. They're seasoning.
This is not that. The quality of the wine was good, and I think that's what really makes a difference. Andrew and Des are both wine lovers. They go and handpick casks from Italian winemakers, from sherry bodegas, and because they're small, if Diageo goes over or Edrington goes over and tries to do the same thing, they want 10,000 casks. That's not going to happen. Those great casks that are sitting there aging quality sherry need to stay there in a Solera system, aging, for a really, really long time. When these guys go over, it's looking for a few dozen of them. It's much, and two, they're working with them on whiskeys. These gentlemen at Edradour, at Signatory, are also happy and proud to tell you who their sherry partners are, who their wine partners are. So you'll very often see actually the name of the winery even on the cask. So when we've done Sauterne in some cases, when we've done sherry in some cases, it's not just some random, this was sherry season. It came from Hidalgo or, whatever the winemaker was. So they have beautiful relationships, which makes a big difference. Cool. These are really wonderful. This is a
wonderful
fabulous range of
cast
whiskeys.
Available from your local Binny's Beverage Depot. So I want to thank everybody for joining us here today. We've taken up an hour of your time. Hopefully you got a nice cocktail in you before you got to make dinner. We'll be back next week. We're going to be around most Wednesdays for a Whiskey Wednesday, but not always. Next week, I think we're here on Tuesday for a Cinco de Mayo. Is that right, Brett?
Yes, we are with Berta Gonzalez Nieves, who was the founder of Casa Dragones Tequila.
And we'll be back next Friday, I think it is, with Denny Potter, Master Distiller of Maker's Mark, and Jane Bowie, who runs their private select program. We're going to be talking about.
I was going to say,
Binny's
I
Private
know that
Select
we've
Makers
got
Mark.
we've got Scotch drinkers out here. I mean, I know that that's what most of you guys are here for. I was really privileged to sit in on a seminar with Jane Bowie from Maker's Mark yesterday, and she is a wood and maturation expert. I learned so much. It was really fun. So you guys definitely tune into that. Hopefully, Pat and Brett are going to invite me back sometime.
Oh, for sure. These probably aren't coming to an end anytime soon. So
yeah,
again,
no kidding.
thanks for joining us. Thanks for tasting. And if you got any questions about anything like this, you can always email spirits@binnies.com. That goes right to me and Brett and our friend Joseph. And one of us will get back to you at any time. And until next week, cheers.
And wait,
Cheers.
and keep drinking.
Keep tasting.
And
Keep tasting.
Mwah. Stay safe out there, everybody. Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Cheers, cheers, cheers. Oh.